The American Civil War. The brutal fight for Southern independence between the Northern states and the South was fought from 1861 to 1865, and the war left the Southern states devastated following their defeat. With their economies shattered, their political structures destabilized, and nearly 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans now navigating their newfound freedom. Even before the war had ended, though, President Abraham Lincoln had begun contemplating a path towards restoring the Union, all while simultaneously addressing the status of the now freed men. His approach, known as a 10% plan, offered a relatively lenient form of Reconstruction, aiming to encourage Southern states to rejoin the Union with minimal punishment for the former Confederates. For us to understand just what Reconstruction was exactly, it's important that we first understand the term. You see, in 1863, we were still fighting. Literally guns blazing, people dying, etc. And when you're at the point of all-out war, both sides have to give a little in order to appease the other in the hopes of, ending a freaking war. So Lincoln's plan initially was to stop the fighting by gradually implementing small-step actions. Under Lincoln's plan, a Southern state could form a new government and re-enter the Union once 10% of its original 1860 voters swore an oath of allegiance to the United States and accepted the abolition of slavery. I ask you, what exactly does it mean to reconstruct something? Well, it means take something that has collapsed and rebuild it, or maybe I could say remodel it into a new form. And President Lincoln envisioned a reconstruction that would reintegrate the South swiftly, rebuild the Union, and provide limited protections for freedom. Though, let's be clear here, he was cautious about granting full political rights to African Americans at that stage, as he and many in Congress believed that it would redivide the nation and fuel further conflict. He believed that a moderate approach would prevent lingering resentment and rebellion in the post-war South. During the war, the federal government had already begun measures that would influence Reconstruction. For instance, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate states and encouraged the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Additionally, efforts by Northern missionaries and educators, often associated with either Methodist, Presbyterian, and the Quaker churches, established Sabbath schools and native schools within the South. You see, these early efforts were designed to teach literacy and basic education to enslaved and freed African Americans without a military enforcement, laying the groundwork for a more organized public education system, sort of like we have now, but during Reconstruction. Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865, however, abruptly ended his leadership during this pivotal moment. While he had outlined a vision for reconciliation and moderate reforms, it was left to his successor to implement Reconstruction policies and navigate the growing tensions between Congress and the executive branch over the rights of freedmen and the political future of the South. So Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, but loyal to the Union, became president after Lincoln's assassination and inherited the immense task of Reconstruction. You see, when Johnson became president, the war had freshly ended, and now the victor's president has now been murdered by a group loyal to the new president's party. Now, if you remember how Lincoln was focused on ending the fighting, Johnson now had the pleasure of working with a widely opposed political spectrum. Johnson's approach towards the former Confederate States was harshly damaged by the now radical Republican majority, who wanted nothing less than full Confederate death. Strongly opposed by his Democratic base, and even a fair amount of middle ground Republican support. So Johnson granted pardons to many ex-Confederates and quickly allowed Southern states to establish governments without substantial protections for African Americans. This policy sparked a direct confrontation with the radical Republicans in Congress, who sought to secure full civil and political rights for the now freed men. Under President Johnson, Southern states moved rapidly to enact black codes, or restrictive laws designed to control the labor and social restrictions of the freed men. These laws often required African Americans to sign yearly labor contracts, restricted their movement, and imposed harsh penalties for vagrancy and curfew laws. The codes aimed to maintain a labor force similar to that of slavery under the guise of freedom, which angered Northern politicians and fueled the radical Republican insistence on stricter federal oversight. In response, Congress enacted the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, overriding Johnson's vetoes. These laws divide the 10 unreconstructed Southern states into 5 military districts, each governed by a U.S. Army general and subject to federal oversight. The districts were Virginia under General John Schofield, North Carolina and South Carolina under General Daniel Sickles, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida under Generals John Pope and George Meade, Arkansas and Mississippi under General Edward Ord, and Texas and Louisiana under General Philip Sheridan and Winfield Scott Hancock. The acts also required Southern states to draft new constitutions that guaranteed African American men the right to vote, prohibited former Confederate leaders from holding office temporarily, and ratified the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. During this period, the Freedmen's Bureau played a central role in helping freedmen navigate their newfound freedoms, provided food, education, medical care, and assisted with labor contracts. Freedmen also began forming their own churches, primarily Baptist and Methodist congregations, which became centers of both spiritual life and political organization. Ministers frequently assumed leadership and roles in their communities, encouraging participation in elections and forming a base for the Republican Party in the South. These advances, though, Johnson's opposition to radical Reconstruction and his continued pardons for ex-Confederates allowed Southern Democrats and insurgent groups to regain some influence. Black political power grew temporarily as African Americans voted in large numbers and held offices in state legislatures. But the period was marked by violence and intimidation from groups such as the Ku Klux Klan aimed at suppressing black political participation. Constitutions and federal statutes during Johnson's term attempted to enforce civil rights, but persistent resistance highlighted the limitations of Reconstruction under a president unwilling to fully champion African American equality. So Ulysses S. Grant, elected president in 1868, represented the radical revision for Reconstruction and became a strong advocate for civil rights. Grant sought to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments with military strength and to ensure African Americans could exercise their voting rights and protect Reconstruction governments from violent opposition. He was actively involved in rebuilding Southern political institutions while strengthening the federal government's ability to intervene when states failed to protect civil rights. Closely with Congress to pass key civil rights legislation, including the Enforcement Acts of 1870 through 1871 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. These laws allowed the federal government to prosecute violent groups suppressing black political participation, impose martial law where necessary, and authorize the suspension of habeas corpus in order to maintain order. Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman aggressively prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan, resulting in over 3,000 indictments and hundreds of convictions, significantly weakening the organization and ensuring free elections for African Americans during the early 1870s. Under Grant's presidency, African Americans achieved unprecedented political representation. By 1872, approximately 15% of Southern office holders were black, many serving in state legislatures, local governments, and even Congress. The 15th Amendment prevented states from denying voting rights based on race, and Grant's administration pressured Southern states, including Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas, to comply with federal standards. Freedmen actively participated in voting, often numbering their share of the population in registration, which allowed them to influence policy, particularly in areas such as education and even infrastructure. Education flourished near Grant's term, with freedmen advocating for universal, state-supported public schools. Northern missionaries established private academies and colleges, while state governments created institutions like Alcora State University in Mississippi to train teachers and to promote literacy. Churches remained central to African American communities, with ministers serving as political leaders and moral guides. Denominations like the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church expanded rapidly, reinforcing the social and political foundations of the black communities. Reconstruction also brought significant economic change. The South saw the emergence of rural merchants, often Jewish peddlers, who acted as the intermediaries between farmers and national markets. These country stores extended credit through the crop lien system, allowing poor white and black farmers to survive in the cash-poor post-war economy. Railroads expanded rapidly, linking rural areas to urban centers, though rampant corruption and speculative misuse of public funds undermined many projects. Taxes increased to fund schools, infrastructure, and state services, generating resentment among white landowners unaccustomed to paying such high state taxes. These advances, Grant faced mounting challenges: corruption within his administration, waning Northern support, and increasing white Democratic resurgence in the South gradually eroded Reconstruction gains. By 1877, following the contentious Compromise of 1877 and the withdrawal of federal troops, Reconstruction effectively ended. Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws, disenfranchising African Americans and rolling back many of the civil and political gains achieved during the previous decade. Reconstruction was a transformative yet deeply contested period in American history. From Lincoln's moderate vision of reunification to Johnson's leniency and opposition to civil rights, and finally to Grant's vigorous enforcement of constitutional amendments and civil rights laws. The era reshaped the South politically, economically, and even socially, African Americans made extraordinary gains in education, religion, and political participation. But persistence persisted, violent opposition, and eventual abandonment by the federal government ensured that these gains were fragile. The legacies of Reconstruction, both its achievements and its failures, would shape American society for generations, highlighting the enduring struggle for equality and justice in the aftermath of the American Civil War.